President, here we are again, the end of a quarter and the end of a calendar year, not the end of our fiscal year. But here we are again, late night sessions, people running around in a very unprofessional manner, in my opinion, talking about how to get our government funded. Let me put this in perspective, Mr. President. This is the end of December. October, November, and December is the first fiscal quarter of the fiscal year 2019. We are already 1/4 through this fiscal year, and we're still talking about the completion of the authorizations and appropriations to fund the government for this year. Not next year, this year. Now, in 2018, the Senate did something we haven't done in a long time, and indeed Congress, and that is, then first time in 22 years, we did get 77%, 75% of the federal government discretionary spending funded. By the way, that's only about 25% of what we spend as a federal government, but that's a comment or a conversation for another day. On July 31 this year, and earlier than that, we started the appropriation process earlier this year and had an opportunity in the Appropriation Committee. The subcommittees and the committee did a fabulous job this year. Democrats and Republicans got together in closed doors with no cameras and really argued the points and came to compromises on most of the issues that by July 31, we had funded 12.5% of this year's federal budget for discretionary spending. We decided as a body, with the leadership's approval, to stay here in August of this year. And because of that, we went from 12.5% to 75% of discretionary budget being appropriated and approved. Indeed, the appropriators did their jobs this year and would have gotten 100% had we not had the disagreement over border security. Let's be clear. As we sit here at the end of this quarter, the U.S. Senate should have already fully funded the federal government's discretionary budget by September 30th of this year. That was 3 months ago, Mr. President. Instead, what we're about to do is have a vote in the next day or two on a continuing resolution for the remaining portion of this year's federal budget, the 25%. This will be the 186th continuing resolution that this Congress and other Congresses have used to continue to fund the government in a temporary manner. Mr. President, I have a major problem with that. First of all, it's an admission that Congress can't do its job. The number one responsibility of Congress is to make sure the government is funded. It's one of the reasons 13 colonies got together in the first place to form this country. But this continuing resolution, as bad as it is, it should not be used, but even in its current potential existence, is so bad for a couple of other reasons. Number one, it does not address the border security issue that the President and the Democrats had prior agreements on. Even we, just a few weeks ago, had agreements on some numbers for border security that are not being honored right now. So it's like you negotiate to a point, and then one side said, well, we're going to back up from that. Well, we're agreeing to this, and then they back up again. Well, Mr. President, the American people are not fooled. This is not an immigration issue any longer. It is clearly a national security issue. The President is right. Over 85% of the illegal drugs come into this country illegally across that border. Almost 100% of the fentanyl that comes into this country comes across that border on the southern border of the United States illegally. But there's a second reason why this is such an insidious thing to do right now with this continuing resolution. It's incredibly disappointing that this continuing resolution does nothing to address disaster relief funding for the people of Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, Alabama, nor California, who have been devastated by historic wildfires and hurricanes. Mr. President, the reason this is so critical right now is that this hits agriculture in these states in a way that is so insidious. The reason is that it hit at exactly the harvest time when the crops were being harvested or potentially going to be harvested. It just devastated entire regions of that portion of the United States. Now in January, in December and January, what these farmers are typically doing is they've taken the money from the crops, paid back the planting loan from this year to the banks, and now in January we'll start the negotiation for the loans for next year for the planting season. So what this continuing resolution does is it kicks the can down the road until a theoretic date. Somebody picked February the 8th as an arbitrary date. This devastates farmers and small-town bankers who are trying to fund next year's crops because they have no way of paying this year's. Mr. President, I am absolutely convinced that President Trump wants to help these farmers and the people in California who've been devastated by these fires. He's said so repeatedly. In fact, in October, on a trip to Georgia and Florida, where he saw the devastation from the hurricane and the tornadoes that came with it and all the damage that came from that event, this is what the president said, and I quote, "Farmers really got hurt, especially here in Georgia, but we're going to get it taken care of," end quote. There's no question the President of the United States wants to make good on that promise. The problem is he's dealing with another party that's not being genuine in their effort to find a solution to this funding issue right now. The Democrats in the House want to clearly push this out into the new year for an obvious reason. And that's what we're pushed to tonight and tomorrow and the next night. Mr. President, I fully believe the United States Senate should be back here the day after Christmas, frankly, to debate this, to get to a resolution, to some compromise, to get the benefits that we've identified are necessary to protect this strategic industry of ours called agriculture. It just seems to me, Mr. President, that most people in the real world, I remember during my career, we would work a half a day on Christmas Eve. I remember that. It hadn't been that long ago. We might take Christmas Day off, and then the next day, most people in America are back at work if they're not taking vacation. But here in the Senate, right now, we won't be back until sometime in January, and we've given ourselves until February the 8th to resolve this issue. That's unacceptable. I believe it's unacceptable to the President. It's certainly unacceptable to a person who comes from the real world and is an outsider of this process. Mr. President, here's another derivative negative to kicking this can down the road. It not only affects the funding that we're talking about this year, it also talks about the planning and the budgeting for fiscal year 20, which starts October 1, 2019. There are right now from January the 8th until July 31, there are 19 weeks or 57 work days in this Senate. Only 57, the way the Senate operates today. And what that means, Mr. President, is that the Senate and the House have to appropriate 12 appropriation bills before, I believe, before July 31 in order to fund the government before September 30th next year. And here's why. The August break is a work break that people in the Senate and the House go home and work in their states during the month of August. If that happens this year, then when we come back in September, we have 12 working days in September. There's no way you're going to get any appropriation bills and the conferences necessary to get that done in September. Mr. President, it is very clear that this continuing resolution is improper. It should not be done, and it puts the people who've been devastated at risk. And Mr. President, I think that right now we need to be very serious about one thing, and that is going forward, we need to find a way to create a politically neutral platform to fund this government on time every year without all this drama. Mr. President, I yield the floor.